Supermarket worker walked the old man home in the rain and discovered a truth that dropped him to his knees. People think racism always wears a badge or waves a flag. But sometimes, it hides behind a plastic smile at the checkout counter. I didn't expect to face it that Tuesday morning, not in the form of a soaking wet old man begging for directions, clutching a crumpled paper bag like it held the last of his dignity. I worked aisle 7. Not glamorous, not heroic, just scanning groceries for people who barely looked up. But something about that old man's shivering hands and the quiet in his eyes pulled me in. His name was Walter. He'd been standing outside the store for almost half an hour, getting drenched. Nobody asked if he needed help. They just stepped around him like he was part of the rain. It was just after 6:30 p.m. The rush hour had calmed down. I just finished restocking peanut butter when I spotted him again, now sitting on the bench near the exit. Rain soaked through his beige coat, and his worn-out dress shoes squelched on the pavement. "Sir, you need a cab or something?" I asked, approaching with my hoodie already dripping from stepping outside. He looked up slowly. His eyes were pale blue, but cloudy, like faded glass. "No cab," he said. "Just trying to find my house." That hit me hard. I offered to walk him, thinking maybe it was just down the block. Something small, a neighborly gesture. I had no idea that walk would stretch through storm and silence and straight into a story that would rattle everything I thought I knew about this town. We stepped off the curb. Cars hissed by. The rain got worse. "Where do you live?" I asked. "On Juniper and West," he muttered. "Been there 60 years. That was a good 15-minute walk in this weather." But he was trembling and had no umbrella, so I pulled mine out and tried to shield us both. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. Felt deeper, something like shame. He asked my name. "Marcus," I said. "You from around here?" "Born and raised. East Side." He nodded, then got real quiet. As we walked, he started talking but not in sentences. More like fragments from a broken timeline. "Used to be a dentist wife, gone 10 years, grandkids in Florida, nobody visits much. When we passed an old boarded-up church," he paused. "That used to be the heart of this town," he said, "before they pushed it out." I looked over. They? City Council. New zoning. Said it didn't match the new development plan. I knew what that meant. That church had been a refuge for black families since the 60s. They bulldozed it last year to make room for luxury condos no one I knew could afford. When we finally reached Juniper and West, he pointed to a little house tucked between two massive McMansions. The porch light flickered like it was scared to shine. He stopped at the gate. "Thank you, son," he said. "You sure you're okay?" He didn't answer, just reached into his soggy bag and pulled out something wrapped in a plastic sleeve. A photo. Old and stained, but clear enough to see a much younger Walter standing next to 3 black men in suits, all smiling. One of them looked just like my late grandfather. "That's from 1965, he said softly. "That's your granddaddy, isn't it?" My breath caught. My grandfather, Ernest Tate, had been a civil rights lawyer. I'd only seen that photo once, framed in my grandma's living room. I looked up at Walter like the storm had just gone silent. "You knew him?" "I marched beside him, got arrested with him in Selma. He saved my life." I stared. "Yuri Waituri, that Walter?" "Walter Hensley." He nodded. I nearly dropped to my knees right there in the mud. Walter Hensley wasn't just a name. He was the son of a notorious segregationist mayor. But after publicly breaking with his father, he became one of the only white allies in our town to openly support the civil rights movement. My grandfather always said, "Even in a garden of poison, one lily can bloom." I helped him up the stairs and inside the house. The living room smelled like cedar and dust. Photos lined the wall. Most were in black and white, marches, signs, picket lines. And there they were, my grandfather and Walter, arms raised in court. Walter sat down, breathing heavily. "I watched it all change," he said. "Thought I could help hold it together. But they erased us, Marcus. They erased him." I looked around. The house was falling apart. There were eviction notices on the table. His power had been shut off. You should have said something. He looked at me and smiled, bitterly. No one listens to an old man anymore. Not if he doesn't fit the narrative. We sat in silence for a long time. Then I did something I didn't expect. I asked him to tell me everything. Every protest, every betrayal, every broken promise. I recorded it on my phone. Every word. Because some truths don't live in textbooks or YouTube clips. Some truths sit in a dark house on Juniper and West, holding stories the world wants to forget. And I wasn't about to let that happen. The rain stopped sometime after 8:30, but I didn't notice until I glanced out Walter's cracked window. The sky had gone a dull steel gray, and the streets were empty, the way they get when the town forgets it's alive. Inside, the air felt heavier than the storm. I sat across from Walter in a worn-out armchair that creaked under my weight, my phone still recording as his words spilled out like water from a broken dam. He spoke like he'd been holding it in for decades. Names, dates, addresses. He remembered everything. Who was arrested with him in 1965? Which diner refused to serve my grandfather? The back alley where a cop once put a gun to his head for shaking a black boy's hand in public. You ever tell your kids about all this? I asked. He shook his head. They didn't want to hear it. Didn't fit the version of me they needed to believe in. I didn't say anything, but it stayed with me. We talk about racism like it's always loud, always violent. But the deepest cuts are quiet, like silence from the people you love. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a yellowed letter addressed to my grandfather. I unfolded it carefully. Ernest, it began. They threatened to pull my license if I showed up to the meeting tomorrow. My father said he'd disown me if I stood with you. I'm coming anyway. It was signed, W.H. I blinked back, something hot in my eyes. Why didn't my family ever mention you? He looked at the floor. They did. Your grandmother sent me a Christmas card every year until she passed. But your dad, I think it hurt him to remember. He lost too much in that fight. He didn't want you carrying the weight. But I should have known, I said. Walter smiled faintly. Now you do. We sat in silence again. The kind that isn't empty but full. Full of ghosts, of grit, of history too often wiped clean. Then I noticed something strange on his bookshelf. A certificate, framed but half covered by dust. I wiped it off. Medal of Freedom, awarded to Dr. Walter Hensley, 1973. You were honored for this? I asked, stunned. He laughed, almost choking. Briefly, Nixon needed good press that year. Gave it to me in a closed ceremony. Didn't even shake my hand. Said it was for optics. You're a literal civil rights hero, I muttered, still staring at the frame. And you're living like this? They took my license, blacklisted me. Every practice I applied to said no. I ended up doing dental work for free, out of this house, until I couldn't hold the drill steady anymore. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood up, paced. People need to know, I said. Your story, what you risked, what you gave up, this town owes you. He waved a shaky hand. They owe a lot of people. I'm just one. No, I said more forcefully than I meant to. You're not just one. You're the proof that not all allies vanished when the cameras did. I stayed until almost 10. When I finally left, I promised to return the next day with groceries, blankets, and someone to fix his heater. But as I walked back home, soaked again, something inside me began to stir. Not just sadness, not just anger, something bigger, something like purpose. The next morning, I called in late to work. Then I posted a clip of Walter talking, just 60 seconds of him describing what happened outside the courthouse in '66, when he blocked a baton from hitting a boy's head. I didn't expect much, but the video exploded. By noon, it had over 20,000 views. By evening, Walter's name was trending locally. I returned to his house that night with bags full of food, my best friend Jermaine, and my phone buzzing nonstop. Jermaine set up a space heater while I brewed tea in the rusted kitchen. Walter looked confused by the attention, but I could tell a small part of him was glad. Like a crack had opened in the wall of silence around his past. Over the next week, I recorded more videos, short, clear, emotional. Walter talking about the summer marches. Walter recalling the burning cross left on his porch. Walter explaining how my grandfather once saved him from a false assault charge. People listened. Then came the journalists. Then the historians. Then a young teacher named Melissa, who asked if she could bring her 8th grade class to meet him. Walter agreed reluctantly, but I saw the way he brushed his hair, cleaned his old shoes. He wanted to be seen. After all these years, he finally believed he deserved it. The class visit happened on a sunny Wednesday. 13 kids filed into the living room, quiet and wide-eyed. They sat on the floor as Walter spoke, not with fire, but with clarity, like a river smoothing the stones of memory. A girl named Maya asked, "Were you scared?" He smiled gently. "All the time, but being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you're awake." Another boy asked, "Did it work?" "What you did?" Walter looked at me, then at the room. "Some days I think yes. Some days I'm not sure. But I know this, if you're sitting here asking that question, then we didn't lose." After the kids left, I helped him back to his recliner. He looked tired but peaceful. "You think your grandfather would have been proud?" he asked. I nodded. "He'd have come here himself, just to say thank you." Walter's eyes glistened. "That means more than you know." That night, we started a fundraiser for him. We called it Honor the Hidden, Walter Hensley's Legacy. Within 48 hours, it crossed $30,000. Then $50,000. People who never met him wrote messages, descendants of marchers. Black families he'd once treated for free. Even an old white woman who said Walter had changed her mind in 1969 and helped me see with both eyes. We used part of the money to renovate his house. Repaired the roof. Painted the porch. Fixed the heater and plumbing. But most importantly, built a website. A digital archive of his story, complete with interviews, photos, documents. We partnered with the local museum. Schools started requesting copies. Walter became living history. And yet, in the middle of all this, something happened that nearly unraveled it all. 2 weeks after the fundraiser, someone spray-painted "Traitor" across his front gate. They shattered a window, left a dead bird in his mailbox. I was furious. I stormed into the police station and demanded action. The officer behind the desk shrugged. "Kids, probably. You know how it is." "Do you?" I snapped. "Do you really?" That's when I realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. So I went public again. I posted pictures of the vandalism. Told the full truth. That Walter was once nearly killed for standing with Black Americans, and now, at 87, he was being threatened again. This time, the response was bigger. Local media picked it up. State officials commented. A city councilwoman, Black, newly elected, came to Walter's home in person and apologized on behalf of the town. They launched a formal investigation. Within a week, 2 suspects were caught. Teenagers from a nearby private school. Sons of wealthy families. The town buzzed with scandal, but Walter refused to press charges. "They're kids," he said. "Let them learn." Instead, he asked that they attend 3 sessions with him. Listen, talk, understand. Reluctantly, they came. By the end of the 3rd session, one of them was crying. I'll never forget what Walter said as they left. "Hating someone because of who they love, how they look, or what they believe, that's learned. But so is compassion. So is courage." He was changing lives even now, and yet Walter's health was failing. Fast. One morning, I arrived and found him in bed, unable to rise. The doctor came, said it was his heart. I sat beside him, held his hand. He looked at me, eyes glassy. "Marcus," he whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." "No, Walter," I said, voice cracking. "Thank you for never closing your eyes." He passed 3 days later. I was there. He died with peace on his face. But what he left behind now, that lives on. The funeral was small, but not quiet. Walter's house had never seen so many people. Teachers, city workers, were veterans, retired activists, and strangers who had only known him through TikTok clips and online articles filled every inch of the living room, kitchen, even the porch. The hallway buzzed with emotion, some faces tearful, others determined. They came not because they had to, but because they finally understood what the town had failed to acknowledge for decades. He died peacefully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. Not just for me, for the whole town. His last request was simple. No church, no procession, no casket. Just tell the truth, he'd said. Let them see me clearly. So that's what we did. We held the memorial in the community center under the banner we had printed. His silence was never compliance. His life was resistance. I stood at the front, my hands trembling over the mic. I'd spoken in front of people before, but this wasn't like any other speech. This wasn't about policy. This was personal. My name is Marcus Tate. Most of you know me as the grocery store worker who walked an old man home in the rain. What you don't know is that walk changed my life forever. I paused, looked around, saw eyes watching, waiting, some unsure, some uncomfortable. Walter Hensley wasn't a perfect man. He was a son of a segregationist mayor. He grew up in a home where racism was law, not just culture. But he made a choice. He walked away from hate and into the arms of justice, knowing it would cost him everything. I took a breath. Do you know what courage that takes? To not just be better than your father, but to stand against him. To lose your title, your money, your future, because you chose the right side of history. There was silence. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the letter Walter had once written to my grandfather. I held it up. This letter, this promises what brought me here today. Walter was a man who didn't just believe in equality. He acted on it. And while this town tried to bury him in obscurity, his legacy couldn't stay buried. Not when the truth finally had a voice. A woman in the back, an older black woman with silver braids, stood and clapped. Others joined. The claps built into a storm of affirmation. After the memorial, something shifted. The mayor called me personally. He offered to rename a street in Walter's honor. I told him no. Don't rename a street, I said. Change the system that made a man like Walter disappear. He paused. What do you suggest? I handed him a list. It included a new curriculum in local schools that teaches not just civil rights history but the local contributions, including Walter's. A permanent community archive in the library featuring Walter's recordings and documents. A plaque outside the courthouse detailing the names of every local activist, black and white, who had been arrested during the 60s protests. And a public fund for elderly civil rights workers in the state who were living in poverty. He blinked at the last one. That'll be tough to pass. Then I'll do it without you, I replied. To my surprise, the town council approved everything. Not because they were brave, but because they were afraid of the attention of the pressure of what people now knew. Sometimes shame moves faster than justice. In the months that followed, the project took over my life. I stopped working at the grocery store. I became something else: an organizer, an archivist, an accidental activist. Every box in Walter's attic held something incredible. Letters, photos, notes from strategy meetings. I discovered a reel of tape, an old recording of my grandfather and Walter speaking at a university in 1970. Their voices echoed like ghosts through the headphones. And then I found something I didn't expect. An unopened envelope with my name on it. Walter had written it before he died. In shaky penmanship, Marcus, you have a gift, not just of listening but of hearing. You asked me for the truth. Now I ask you for something in return. Don't let them wash it away again. Tell our story. Not for glory, not for revenge. But so no child in this town grows up thinking silence is neutral. Silence is a choice. And you, my boy, have chosen noise. Keep shouting. Walter, I cried. Not the small kind. The kind that takes your knees out. The kind that hits you because a man who wasn't your blood made you feel like family anyway. That letter became the opening page of the archive. That fall, the high school hosted the first annual Hensley Tate Lecture on Courage. I gave the keynote. My father came. We hadn't talked much since Walter died. But afterward, he hugged me and whispered, "Your granddad would be proud." But just as the healing began, a newspaper article dropped that threatened to blow it all apart. A local columnist dug into Walter's past before the marches, before he met my grandfather. She found yearbook photos, quotes from the old high school paper, things Walter had said at age 16, ugly things, racist things. The article's headline read, "The Hidden Past of Our New Hero." I was furious, not because it was false, but because it was cruel. I wrote a response. I didn't deny what Walter had once believed. I highlighted it. Walter Hensley was raised on hate, I wrote. He unlearned it, rejected it, sacrificed for it. If that isn't the definition of growth, what is? We cannot demand perfection from people born into imperfection. Redemption is the whole point. The community rallied. Teachers wrote op-eds. Students made videos. Survivors of the marches shared testimonies about what Walter did when it mattered. And slowly the tide turned again. The columnist doubled down, but she lost credibility. The town had seen something deeper than sound bites. They had seen humanity, and humanity can't be canceled. By winter, the Fund for Elderly Civil Rights Veterans had helped 5 other families. One of them, a woman named Loretta, who once sang spirituals to jailed protesters, called me crying. "Nobody's remembered me in 30 years, she said. But you did." No, Walter did. One afternoon, I went back to Walter's house alone. Snow had begun to fall. The new roof held firm. The porch light we'd fixed glowed warmly. I stepped into his old chair and looked around. It didn't feel empty. It felt alive. In the kitchen, the kettle still worked. I brewed tea, his favorite kind, black with lemon, and sat by the window, sipping slowly. Then I saw them. 2 kids, maybe 12, standing at the gate. They were holding notebooks. I went outside. "Can we ask about Mr. Walter?" one said. "Our teacher said you knew him." I knelt to their level. I did. They opened their notebooks, full of questions. I smiled. "Come inside," I said. "Let me tell you a story about a man who stood in the rain and never stopped walking toward justice." The 2 kids sat on the floor, legs crossed, notebooks open, eyes wide. I took Walter's old chair, its leather worn smooth from years of listening. And in that quiet living room, I told them everything, not the cleaned-up version. Not the history textbook summary, but the raw truth. I told them how Walter once crossed the street to shake a black man's hand in 1963 and lost his job for it. How he stood on the courthouse steps with my grandfather as the crowd shouted slurs and threw rocks. How he went home that night, bloodied, and still wrote thank you notes to the families who marched beside him. I showed them the photograph of Walter and Ernest Tate, arms linked, smiling defiantly in front of a hostile crowd. They asked simple, honest questions. Why did people hate him for helping? Didn't he get scared? Why didn't more white people do what he did? I answered each one the best I could. He got scared all the time, but he kept showing up. That's what made him brave. People hated him because he challenged their comfort. He made them look in a mirror they didn't want to face. And as for why more people didn't do what he did, that's the question we're still asking. They stayed for an hour. When they left, they promised to tell their classmates about Walter. One of them said, "I want to be like him." That night, I sat on the porch as snow piled silently on the stairs. The street was quiet, the town hushed by winter. But I felt something loud in my chest, something like legacy, like responsibility. Walter had passed the torch, and now it was burning in my hands. Over the following months, the ripple grew. The town council, under public pressure, allocated funds to restore the old church they once demolished, the one Walter pointed out during our walk. They turned it into a freedom center, a place for education, community organizing, and storytelling. On opening day, they hung a plaque at the entrance, in honor of those who walked through fire, even when no one watched, dedicated to Walter Hensley and Ernest Tate. I gave the opening speech. My dad sat in the front row. The first exhibit inside was Walter's dental chair, scratched, old-fashioned, but symbolic. Next to it was a screen playing video clips of his interviews. The march stories, the jail stories, the quiet grief he carried when nobody would hire him after standing on the right side of history. People came from across the state. Some remembered his face. Others met him through screens and sound bites. All left changed. But the real victory came later. One evening, as I was helping Loretta, another forgotten elder from the civil rights era, get her heater fixed, I received a message from a university professor. He wanted to include Walter's letters and interviews in a national archive on white allies in the civil rights movement. I agreed, but I asked one thing, that the archive not frame Walter as a white savior, but as a listener, a follower, a fighter who stood shoulder to shoulder, not above or ahead. He said yes, and that changed everything. Soon, the national media picked up the story. A documentary team came to town. A major podcast featured Walter's journey, opening with the sound of rain hitting the sidewalk and a young man's voice saying, "It started with a walk home, and it ended with a new beginning." And through it all, I kept walking. I traveled to other towns, found other elders like Walter forgotten, hurting, still holding truths no one had asked about in years. I recorded them, shared their stories. Some went viral, some didn't, but each one lit another candle in the dark. People began calling it the Porch Project. We didn't have fancy sponsors or slick marketing, just phones, folding chairs, and hearts willing to listen. Then came the day that changed my life. A law firm, one of the biggest civil rights firms in the country, called me. They'd seen my work. They offered to sponsor my education, said they'd mentor me if I wanted to become a civil rights lawyer. I hesitated. I had never seen myself that way before. I was a grocery store worker with no degree, just a voice and a phone and a memory of walking an old man home. But Walter had once said, "You have a gift. Use it." So I said yes. I moved to DC 2 months later, started school. It was hard, humbling. I was older than most students, less polished. But I carried something they didn't, a direct line to lived history, to the kind of wisdom that doesn't come from books. On the day I was accepted into the firm's internship program, I visited Walter's grave. It was a modest plot on the edge of the town cemetery, next to a magnolia tree that bloomed too early every spring. The headstone was simple: Walter James Hensley, 193622025. He stood in the storm and never asked for shelter. I knelt beside it and laid down a copy of the community archive, now printed, bound, and included in the Smithsonian's digital records. I traced the letters of his name with my fingers. "You're still being heard, old man," I said quietly. "You didn't disappear. You didn't get erased." And then I whispered, "Thank you for choosing to walk home that night." I stood up, wiped the snow from my coat, and turned toward the road. But just before I left, I looked back one last time. In that moment, I saw more than a grave. I saw a seed, and it was already growing. Epilogue: 1 year later. The Porch Project became a nonprofit. We launched chapters in over 20 states. Dozens of youth-led teams now sit with elders, listen to untold stories, and preserve them online and in community exhibits. We partner with libraries, schools, museums. Our motto is simple: truth lives on the porch. Walter's story has been turned into a book, which is now used in public school curricula. I still get emails every week from teachers, students, family members of people who marched with Walter, and sometimes from strangers who say things like, "I didn't know this side of history existed. Thank you." But I always tell them it's not my story. It was Walter's, and my grandfather's, and all those who stood, knelt, marched, wept, fought, and forgave. I'm just the one who listened in the rain. And now I help others listen too. Because when we walk each other home through storms, silence, and history, we discover truths that not only drop us to our knees, they teach us how to rise. The end.